Afternoon, good evening. Thank you again for joining us today as we host this G20 Ocean Dialogue on advancing offshore renewables for ocean climate action. My name is Felipe Victoria, and I am the Senior Manager for Multilateral Affairs and International Government Relations here at Ocean Conservancy. I am delighted to welcome former Secretary of State John Kerry to set the scene for this dialogue. Secretary Kerry, a pivotal architect of the Paris Agreement on climate change and a steadfast advocate for environmental and international diplomacy. Most recently, he served as the inaugural U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, spearheading global efforts to combat climate change.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be able to be with you, and it's really good to be with you at this pivotal moment for our planet and at such a definitional moment for the oceans. And I begin by expressing my gratitude to President Lula in Brazil for the vision and leadership in creating Oceans 20, and to the Ocean Conservancy and all the partners for organizing this event in order to take our vision, which is critical, and translate it into action. So as we gather under the banner of the G20, and we are obviously reminded of the immense responsibility that we all share. Brazil, of course, is not just leading the G20 meeting later this year, but Brazil is on deck to assume the leadership from Azerbaijan, and with it, the COP presidency in 2025. So, my friends, it is only fitting that together we are linking both the challenges and the opportunities that are presented by the climate crisis. And nobody should doubt that despite how devastating some of the damages around the world, there are opportunities that are given us, particularly on the economic side, on the discovery side. So each of you understands, and the reason you are here is because we are all committed to responding to the reality that the climate crisis is anything but a distant threat. It is so much here now and accelerating at a pace that exceeds the predictions of the scientists over many, many years. We're seeing the damage all around the world, the record-breaking heat waves, the numbers of people who are dying from heat, extreme heat causes, and of course, the devastation of agriculture, the vast array of floods, the level of intensity of storms, and sadly and ironically, much of that damage increase comes as a result of the oceans warming. 90% of the heating of the planet goes into the oceans. And we are now changing the chemistry of the oceans more than they have been changed in literally millions of years. So there are three great challenges that we face with respect to the oceans. One, there is just the rapacious rate at which we are exploiting the resources of the ocean. But two, there is the vast amount of carbon that is being dumped into the ocean, raising the acidity of the ocean itself, and part of the most significant contribution to the change of the chemistry. And of course, there is the consequence of overdevelopment, development of the fact that shipping itself contributes very significantly to that acidification. So we have to join all of us together. And every record-breaking moment of heat or devastating flood or disappearing glacier, we really have to understand that this is Mother Nature's unmistakable and unrelenting message. We need to change course, and we need to change course now. As all of you know, at COP28, we took a major step forward, where almost 200 nations agreed that we are going to transition away from fossil fuel in a way that is orderly and fair and equitable, but we have to do so accelerating in this decade. And that is the pledge we took in order to reach net zero 2050 on the target the science has given us. So we need to seize this challenge that we established for ourselves and be honest and be fair to the citizens that are counting on us to be able to produce the response that is necessary. One thing we know for certain, there's no course that you can chart towards a net zero world that doesn't navigate the ocean. It's that simple. You can't solve the climate crisis without protecting the ocean, and you can't protect the ocean without solving the climate crisis. Meeting both of these imperatives actually puts us in a place where crisis meets opportunity. The ocean has been our incredible protector, absorbing vast amounts of carbon, shielding us from the worst impacts of the climate crisis, but also, I don't know if everybody is aware, providing 51% of the oxygen that we breathe. Now that the bill is coming due for the way in which we have heated our homes and explored and traveled the world and run our factories and so forth, all of that bill is coming due at a moment where the ocean is most endangered. And we need to make certain that it becomes our partner in the transition to the clean energy future. And it has to become, in the doing so, an agent in its own healing. Research from the High Level Ocean Panel shows that ocean-based climate solutions could deliver up to 35% of emissions reductions in order to address the current emissions gap. And almost a third can be realized through offshore renewables. But here's the challenge. While the cost of offshore wind has fallen, the initial barriers to entry into that market remain pretty high. And the fact that aside from China, no developing country has installed offshore wind capacity is really a stark underlining of the imbalance that persists in our global energy transition. The global South cannot be left to shoulder this burden alone. If we're serious, all of us, about achieving our climate goals, then we have to provide the leverage and the incentives necessary to make offshore renewables a reality in every corner of the globe. This means concessional financing. It means lowering the cost of premiums. It means enabling or creating enabling environments that not only protect biodiversity, but also empower governments to commit to these vital technologies. And crucially, my friends, we must also increase our own ambition in our NDCs, which is called for by COP28 and has to happen in the beginning of this next year. So none of us, in our exercise of responsibility for future generations, none of us can avoid the fact that we are at a tipping point that has been predicted by scientists for some period of time. The decisions that we make today or fail to make today and avoid will literally determine the future of the oceans, our climate, and our world. But with the right ambition, the right policies, the right partnerships, we can reshape the course of the future. I'm not kidding when I say that I believe we can win this battle. It's absolutely clear to me that we're making progress, massive progress, on new technologies, on storage, on solar, on hydrogen, and alternative possibilities of clean energy from nuclear and elsewhere. But we need greater scale and we need greater speed. That is the only way that we achieve our goals and win this battle. Future generations are counting on us to ensure a healthier, more equitable world for generations to come. And it is clear that if we do execute this energy transition in the ways that we know how to, we can actually fulfill all of our obligations and fulfill our promises to the future. Doing so at scale and at speed, as John Doerr has written about in his terrific book, doing it at scale and speed is the challenge. So I wish you great deliberations, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you in these next months and years so that we meet our goal of 2030 and achieve the transition that we have promised the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Kerry, for your remarks. I now want to welcome Eric Giersky and Amisa Patel to offer opening remarks. Eric is the head of the Action Platform for Ocean at the United Nations Global Compact. Eric leads efforts to engage businesses, governments, and civil society in exploring sustainable practices within ocean industries. Amisha Patel is the interim head of the Global Offshore Wind Alliance and leads the initiative's global expansion. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Felipe, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. And what a fantastic program you have today. I'm so grateful for Ocean Conservancy organizing this and inviting us to speak. So thank you very much. And I would like to start maybe echoing Secretary John Kerry's words that we can win this battle. This is an increasing pressure we see on our planet that makes it even more important to do more. And we have to do it at greater scale and greater speed, as I said. And that is really our mandate at the UN Global Compact. The UN Global Compact is the UN initiative for private sectors, so that we can have non-state actors collaborating, setting ambitious, measurable targets to really deliver on all the 17 SDGs. The UN Global Compact today have country offices in over 70 countries worldwide. We have about 700 staff, but first and foremost, we have 25,000 companies all over the world really working hard to turn ambitions into impact. The Ocean team, based in New York and all over the world, is really working with key ocean industries in shipping, ports, offshore energy, food system, plastic, and governance and academia to really systemically try to solve this in the best possible way and faster and moving forward in the right direction. We are also the co-host of the G20 Ocean Group, and we are really honored that Brazil tasked us with this very important task. G20 is, of course, the political hotspot of today. The UN is the regulatory big machine, but we need forums like the G20 to address economic and political issues at the top level. I think the G20 is also very clear in pointing at UN as an important stakeholder to really set the long-term pathway for the world. Brazil has identified 3 critical issues for the presidency. It's multilateral reform, it's sustainable development through energy transition, and it's fighting poverty through new food systems. And sustainable development through energy systems, through clean and affordable energy, is of course critical. And this is something that we have been working on with many of you here today on a long-term basis. We see that the ocean is a super big resource of energy. As John Kerry also said, we have to protect the ocean, we have to save the ocean to save the planet, but we also have to use it better and smarter. There is lots of energy, not only wind, but also solar, tidal energy out in the ocean. But so far, we have really managed to harvest the offshore wind. It's taking off, but it's too slow. And our job at the UN Global Compact is to identify how can we find better solutions to scale up this faster. Not only in the global north, but all over the world, which you also addressed. And I think that's an extremely important point. We have to de-risk the development of offshore wind in the global south. At the UN Global Compact, at the Ocean team here, we are working with all the leading offshore companies worldwide to see how we can make standards, good standards for offshore wind, to make it more transparent and easier to build out, more predictable for financiers, for insurers, for operators and governments. And we have had 3 key work streams. The first one last year was data sharing for the offshore wind industry, so that we can agree on what data are proprietary and what can be shared publicly, so that we can learn faster to grow this industry better and more transparent. Second part, very important, is nature positive. Nature positive is extremely important to have an alignment on. What does that mean in offshore industries? And as you know, we have about 70 gigawatt capacity deployed in the ocean today. That means thousands of windmills out there. In the next few years, the target is 380 gigawatt by 2030 and 2,000 gigawatt by 2050. To do that right, we need a clear pathway for how the footprint of these build-outs are on the nature basis. So that is something we are deeply looking forward to discuss with all of you, also at COP16, for those of you who will be there in Cali in Colombia. And lastly, we are starting the work stream on just transition, addressing not only the global south and the global north of offshore wind development, but also the local communities, other industries in the marine spatial areas affected by offshore wind planning and build-outs. And these are taken very differently throughout the world. As we know, shipping is much more globally organized industry, but offshore wind doesn't have this formal body of regulation for global standards. And this is something that we need to develop very fast, at least on an industrial level, and hopefully also an intergovernmental level. These input sessions are very important for Brazil and for us as co-conveners as the Ocean 20. So far, we have had meetings in Shanghai, in Singapore, in DC, in Oslo, and Barcelona, and so forth. And we will have more this fall. And these outputs of these sessions, like we are having today, they are transcribed into very clear recommendations for the heads of state of the G20. And I've been working on this for months now with Alexander Turra of the Sao Paulo University and World Economic Forum, and other good colleagues in the co-chair group of the Ocean 20. And I would just like to say this at the start of this meeting. Be very clear about the recommendations so that we can bring them on to the decision makers of the G20 member states. This is a very important political forum. Offshore wind is too important to fail. We have to build it out, and it has to be done very smart and very long term. So we have a cost-efficient, reliable, secure energy for all the populations in the world. So with that, Philippe, I thank you so much for granting me the honor to give some opening remarks. Really looking forward to work more with all of you, and please reach out. I'll also drop some of our reports in the chat and some of the work streams that's currently going on towards UNGA, G20, and the COP sessions this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Amisha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Philippe. And I'd like to say a very warm thank you to the Ocean Conservancy for initiating this dialogue, and of course your continued engagement and support as a member of the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. Also thanking Secretary Kerry and Eric for their opening remarks as well. Very complimentary to the message that I think I want to deliver on behalf of GOA today as well. We've heard from them both around some of the stats around the Ocean Panel last year, which opened up and unraveled the sheer potential that offshore wind and ocean-based climate solutions have to play in our journey to mitigate climate change and lead us closer to the targets under the Paris Agreement. I think we can agree that offshore wind really stands out as a significant opportunity. Once again, projected that over 1/3 of emissions reductions attributed to the ocean will come from offshore wind. And I underscore the will, because as we've said, with the right policy mechanisms in place, with acceleration and with collective action, we will reach this goal. But let's take stock of where we are currently. The Global Wind Energy Council's Market Intelligence Database shows that more than 400 offshore wind projects are in operation worldwide currently. And as of the end of 2023, total installed capacity reached around 75 gigawatts. And G20 countries account for almost all of this installed capacity. So to meet the target that has been identified, 2,000 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2050. We've got to deploy 380 gigawatts by 2030. Now, this is a target that has been adopted in our call for action as GOA as well, and of course being outlined by the EIA and by IRENA. The gap highlights the urgent need for accelerated deployment, but also the untapped potential that exists and which requires scaling up of our efforts. As we've said, particularly in developing nations, where offshore wind is increasingly being prioritized as a core component of national energy strategies. And we've seen the adoption of the tripling target last year really act as an impetus and a catalyst in this. But to push forward, we've got to collectively address the challenges that lie ahead, and we've got to take these on board. In the last year, we've seen nations advance to make permitting processes streamlined and accessible, whilst ensuring that projects are developed responsibly. Enabling supply chains to develop and cooperate globally will also be key, and our work here continues. And of course, one of the pressing issues and of discussion today is the lack of financing mechanisms and robust market designs, particularly in emerging markets. And I'll say these areas are in line with GOA's existing work streams, and our work here continues. The Global Offshore Wind Alliance was established very much with this mission in mind. The alliance was founded by the government of Denmark, IRENA, and the Global Wind Energy Council. GOA has been created to become a global driving force for the uptake of offshore wind and to ensure that we're keeping our 2050 targets very much in reach. But we believe the success relies heavily on collaboration. We have seen this evident in the North Sea, where long-term political support coupled with cross-national cooperation has enabled robust policy and planning to come through and lead to deployment. It is essential that governments, the private sector, international organizations, civil society, and all stakeholders work together to remove barriers to scaling offshore wind. GOA is uniquely positioned to lead this transformation effort. It is why we were created. We unite stakeholders to support policy frameworks, to build and develop efficient offshore wind value chains, and of course, through bringing together stakeholders to knowledge exchange and support capacity building to remove the barriers to deployment. We are so grateful for the G20 nations currently engaged in our work and in our mission, but we look forward to welcoming more of you into our international community of practice and members. Currently, we are 30 members strong, 22 of which are national and regional governments. We need more of you on board. As we embark upon today's dialogues, let us remember that the ocean is a crucial ally in this fight against climate change. Offshore wind is our opportunity, and together, through collaboration and commitment, we can make the ambitious goals of the G20 and the wider global offshore wind community a reality. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And like Eric, I'll also say, if you would like to find out more about the Global Offshore Wind Alliance and our work, I'll share my contact details and would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amisha and Eric, for your truly insightful remarks. I now invite Shamini Silvartanam, the Associate Director of International Climate and Clean Energy at Ocean Conservancy, to deliver a short presentation on concessional finance and then moderate our first panel. Shamini, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Felipe. I am just going to wait for the presentation to come on screen, and then we will go from there. So as Secretary Kerry said in his remarks, analysis by the high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy shows that ocean-based climate mitigation solutions can contribute as much as 35% of emission reductions needed to stay on track to within 1.5 degrees of warming. Ocean-based renewable energy and phasing out offshore oil and gas are by far the two biggest opportunities. Over a third of the emission reduction from the ocean is from renewables, which are expected to come from offshore wind. This makes offshore wind an invaluable climate mitigation solution to combat climate change and protect the ocean. Next slide. I'm not going to go over this slide too much because Amisha spoke about it at length in her presentation. So I will just skip over to the next slide because we already know what's needed to close the emissions gap. Next slide, Robin. This map is from the SMAP, which is the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program at the World Bank, that shows the global offshore wind potential. Currently, there are 315 operating offshore wind farms worldwide, and G20 members account for 99% of installed offshore wind capacity. To reach 2,000 gigawatts by 2050, we need to deploy an average of 70 gigawatts per year. And increasingly, governments in emerging and developing economies have prioritized offshore wind as a component or foundational element of their national energy strategy and have prioritized the analysis of offshore wind as part of their future energy mix. And concessional finance will be key to ensuring the ambition of these countries can materialize into projects on the ground. Next slide. Between 2021 and 2022, climate project grants averaged $69 billion per year out of $1.27 trillion, mostly from debt or equity. Only 4% of climate finance in the energy sector was provided as grants or low-cost debt, posing challenges for developing countries. International development finance for renewable energy is modest, with just 9.14 billion committed in 2021, including about $500 million for wind, both on and offshore. This suggests that mobilizing climate finance at scale is needed for offshore wind projects, and it will require focused efforts. Next slide. Now, in terms of the World Bank and IFC produced a study about concessional finance for emerging market, in which they had a model offshore wind project where they did a cost comparison. So a commercial financing for offshore wind with this 1 gigawatt model project would be $108 per megawatt, which is higher than other forms of renewables. To be cost competitive, offshore wind needs an LCOE of $70 per megawatt, excluding environmental and other non-financial factors. Next slide. Now, there are two opportunities for enhancing concessional finance. One is technical assistance and direct finance to governments, and then the other is deploying blended finance. So empowering governments and providing technical assistance and concessional finance to national governments would create supportive regulations, improve data on offshore wind potential, and upgrade power grids. This strategy would enhance developer interest in investment readiness, but does not directly mobilize the large amounts of finance needed for offshore wind projects. And then blended finance for private sector, using blended finance instruments like concessional loans and equity, would lower the cost of capital and reduce the risk of offshore wind projects in developing countries. This approach would attract significant private investment, but does not necessarily address the broader infrastructure and technical capacity needs. Next slide. This brings us to why concessional finance, right? Concessional finance for conservation is crucial for integrating conservation into offshore wind development. It could support environmental impact assessments, ongoing monitoring, accountability measures to ensure sustainable practices. It could ensure global standards compliance, such as adhering to IFC's performance standards or IUCN's net positive impact on biodiversity standards, ensuring offshore wind projects contribute to biodiversity conservation. Governments can encourage compliance through results-based finance and grant matching. And finally, technical assistance for governments. Providing technical assistance to national governments would boost their capacity to map offshore wind resources, identify optimal sites, and implement biodiversity protection measures. This includes upgrading infrastructure to support offshore wind. And with that, I'll actually end my presentation and move into our next panel, which is going to focus on strategies for mobilizing concessional finance and biodiversity for offshore wind. And I'd love to invite my panelists now to join me. So first, I'd like to invite Ingrid Brume, who is the Senior Vice President of Group Stakeholder Relations at Ørsted. Ingrid, welcome. And Alfredo Yaron, who is the Head of Ocean Action Agenda at the World Economic Forum. Charlotte Morgensen, who is the Director of Ocean Conservation at Velu Foundation. Christina Simile, who is the Director of Offshore Energy and Nature at the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. Rebecca Williams, who is the Global Head of Offshore Wind at the Global Wind Energy Council. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate you having you at this very important discussion. And so I'll just kick it off because I know we are running a bit behind and some of you have other commitments with the first questions. So Ingrid, my first question is actually to you. Tell me about how Ørsted is incorporating biodiversity conservation into the planning and execution of your offshore wind projects. And what are some best practices you could share with the industry?
Thank you very much, Shamimi, and thank you very much for putting this very important topic on the agenda for today. Because as was also said by Secretary Kerry as part of his introductory remarks, of course, if we do clean energy projects right, with scale and with speed, we both have an opportunity, of course, to reduce CO2 with the negative consequence we have for the energy system. But we also, if we work well and incorporate nature, both when we do our siting and our design, later our build and our operations, we actually have a possibility for a positive contribution. And as some of you will know, in Ørsted, we are the world leader within offshore wind. We have around 3 decades, a bit more of experience of building offshore wind projects around the globe. And just a few years back, we set ourselves the additional target of net positive biodiversity projects, so that all our renewable energy projects after 2030 should contribute positively to biodiversity. And for those of you who work with biodiversity, you may know this is maybe easy to say, but it's difficult to do, and not least difficult to measure in practice. So over the last 5 years or so, we've had a number of work streams and projects going on together with partners, research partners, NGOs, also peers in the industry, and working on a number of fronts. So just to share a few of the things that we've been working with. We're working on the technology side, so trying to, when we build the offshore wind park, to minimize the impact as much as possible. We just launched a new noiseless foundation technology where we actually reduce the noise level with 99%. And that we have tried that and now got some positive results from that, using that in the North Sea. So that's on the technology side. We do monitoring. We use AI technology for that. We have a number of pilot initiatives together with NGOs. We've worked a lot with the World Wildlife Foundation. We've got a large coral initiative in Taiwan. So of course it depends on the habitat, what makes sense. And then just right before, when the summer started, we launched a 8-step biodiversity measurement framework. So the next generation of biodiversity measurement frameworks that works for the offshore wind industry in particular. And that is to try to get much closer to how we measure, how we track, and not least how we document delivery of net positive impact. It builds on existing frameworks, so it's not, you could say, Ørsted unique, and that's of course very important for us to be able to enter into a dialogue with the wider community here. And at the moment we have it out in a stakeholder hearing and are gathering as much input as possible as we can, because we need it to be actionable, we need it to be very transparent, but also operational, of course. Because as you mentioned also, and Eric mentioned, the scale that we wish to see and would like to see over the coming years of the build out of offshore wind means that the biodiversity framework that we apply have to be able to be operational and can deliver that scale and that speed that we need. So maybe just ending on a point around financing, we also launched last year the first blue bond ever launched by an energy company. It was 100 million euros private placement for sustainable shipping and biodiversity initiatives. We received a lot of positive feedback around that, so let's see if we can do more. But as also the headline of today's discussion, of course, the whole question around finance, getting investments to flow, getting the cost of capital down is absolutely essential in order to be able to move forward. So that will be just sharing a few words of practice, and it's very important for us to say that we would really like to collaborate with peers, research institutes, NGOs, governments all over the world, because this is not an effort that one company can do on its own. It's very much a collective effort.
Thank you, Ingrid, for your response. I really liked how you provided a holistic overview and talked about the cross-sectoral collaboration and the blue bonds that you launched. It was quite, pioneering at the time. So thank you for sharing that. And because we just touched on finance, I want to bring in Charlotte. My question is to you next, Charlotte. We've talked quite a lot about how public financing is not enough. We need to bring in private financing, but philanthropic financing is also key. So I'd like to ask you, what role do you see for philanthropy? From a foundation perspective, how can philanthropic funding complement public and private investments in offshore wind to ensure both climate and biodiversity goals are met?
Thank you so much, Mina, and thank you so much to the Ocean Conservancy for taking this excellent initiative and discussing this important issue. And I think both with Ambassador Carey and also Ingrid that mentioned, that biodiversity is also a part of it, to take that into account when you expand, especially in the North Sea, where you have to expand offshore wind in the rate that we have here in Denmark, where the Velux Foundation is based. We believe that philanthropic funding can play a crucial role in complementing public and private investments in offshore wind, particularly by ensuring that climate and biodiversity goals are achieved. And we find that there is a need to address the environmental impact. So the expansion of offshore wind is taken on an informative basis with the best available science. And there we think that philanthropic funds can be directed towards research and development initiatives that focusing exactly on creating and enhancing offshore wind technologies that minimizes the environmental impact. And we think as a Danish-based foundation that we are in the unique position with the fact that the expansion of offshore wind will happen in the North Sea, and that we have the possibility of funding several research projects that addresses the environmental impact of the operation of it and find innovative solutions to reduce these possible impacts. We also believe that as we are looking into the environmental impact and looking into addressing the climate and biodiversity issues, we have therefore, in cooperation with Ørsted and two of the Danish ministries in Denmark, taking the initiative for an upcoming conference that is looking at the blue consequences of the green transition. And I think that's really important to look at how can we actually look at the cumulative effects and how can we get the best results out of the expansion that we are foreseeing for the oceans to reduce fossil fuels as quickly as possible. While private and public sectors may focus on the economy and energy output of offshore wind projects, we believe that us as a philanthropic organization are in a unique position to focus on the funded initiatives that can have a more holistic view of the potential biodiversity impact, which are then again, like Ingrid also mentioned, can be used to track ecological consequences of offshore wind and provide information for adaptive monitoring strategies. And in that regard, we think that capacity building is crucial when establishing offshore wind. We see that foundation can invest both in capacity building initiatives that empower local communities, but also conservation organizations that can assist policy makers with the knowledge and tools needed to advocate for biodiversity-friendly offshore wind development. We therefore also believe that there is a need for policymakers and industry to make an informed decision, and therefore we believe that foundations are in a unique position to actually develop research that is needed and fund steering group that are needed to achieve transparencies, to achieve climate and biodiversity objectives when we expand on the offshore wind. And also, I think that by strategically directing your resources as a philanthropic organization, you can fill critical gaps, drive innovation, and ensure that offshore wind development not only contributes to climate goals, but also enhances and preserves marine biodiversity. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Charlotte. I really liked the thing that you touched on, capacity building and sort of filling in the gaps with philanthropic funding, because there's quite a lot of gaps to be filled as we try to move on doing this at pace and scale that's required. My next question is for Alfredo. Alfredo, World Economic Forum, has been engaging businesses to adopt a nature-positive approach in the offshore wind sector. The global, the Ocean Action, Friends of Ocean Action Forum that you had has been doing this work. Could you specifically highlight what the Ocean Action Agenda Offshore Working Group is currently doing on this and share some insights with us?
Thank you so much, Shamini, and thanks to the organizers for really highlighting this event. I think that the G20 has opened up this process for the ocean to take the spotlight, and it's really important to go into some of these deep conversations about the trends, the transition, and the opportunities to tie that to ocean health. So thank you very much for that, and great to see both Ingrid and Charlotte go and set up the framing so perfectly for my intervention as well, on how do we, at the World Economic Forum, our role is convening and making sure that a lot of the pieces that are out there are starting to come together and talk to the relevant stakeholders. So really, what we do at the World Economic Forum and at the Ocean Action Agenda in particular is to serve as that convener for government, for industry, for civil society, for philanthropy, to think about that blue transition, but also to think about the links to energy, to food, to biodiversity, and to other topics. So very specifically to your question, we are convening, along with our Center for Energy and Materials, a Responsible Renewables Task Force. It goes a little bit beyond offshore wind, but of course it includes offshore wind. And it's a group of renewable developers that, in partnership with key stakeholders across the renewable energy infrastructure value chain, will work towards driving consensus and committing to action to derive these outcomes that we are all looking for, people and nature at the same time. And so we already heard from Ingrid of the great work that Ørsted is already doing in this space. The next step is, how do we take that as an inspiration so that it becomes the industry standard, that it becomes what governments expect from developers, that it becomes what financial institutions and what philanthropies expect, and almost either to say condition in some cases where it's appropriate to be the case. So if we do this right, if as a community we can come together and put all of these pieces to make sense with each other, we will hopefully get to a point where these criteria for people and nature positive are going to be part of tenders, are going to help us think about permitting processes, are going to dictate how do we do measuring and monitoring, and eventually how do we think about PPAs. So the idea is, how do we build this momentum? How do we take all of the great work that is already happening and start that broader conversation that will lead us to government and action policy, to those frameworks, to setting even more ambitious goals, to thinking about the partnerships, to unlocking the finance, and eventually to also unlock some of that data, technology, innovation that we need to deliver on this big, big, big ambition. So thank you for your question. And
thanks, Alfredo. The Responsible Renewables Task Force sounds like it is doing some great work. You're starting on that. Institutionalizing this best practices would be really key to address the two things that we're talking about, energy transition while also it being nature positive. So that's great to hear. On that note, my next question is going to go to Christina. Christina, you work with a broad coalition of NGOs and other stakeholders. Tell me about how Ocean is working with industry stakeholders to ensure that offshore wind projects contribute to a nature positive future, and what specific measures are being encouraged to minimize, the ecological impacts.
Thank you, Shamini, and thanks to the Ocean Conservancy for the invitation. I heard already very inspiring messages from the previous speakers, so that I will try to complement what has been already said. So I represent here a platform of exchange gathering since 2020, almost 50 organizations working in the EU Sea Basin, being the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Atlantic EU, but also the Mediterranean. We brought together different stakeholders group, being the wind industry, the transmission system operators, and the NGOs, to work on two very complementary aspects. The one is the need of speeding and accelerating the implementation, the deployment of offshore wind, but also of grid, because we need to be reminded that, of course, the generation without the grid and the capacity of actually transmitting this electricity would be wasted. And at the same time, also looking at harmonizing those targets with protection and restoration targets. So that we brought these three group of stakeholders together in order to make them, first of all, share. So it's a platform, it's a community of practice where we share knowledge, we share experiences. As Ingrid said, it's easy to say, difficult to do. Actually, sometimes it's also difficult to understand when it comes to biodiversity. There are concepts that on which we need to create a common understanding. Therefore, we have created this platform where these different group of stakeholders, they bring their views, they bring their experiences, in order then to come up with a common position, with common ground that we bring to EU institutions, to regional institutions, but also to national institutions. So in some way, by doing these efforts of bringing these three groups of stakeholders together, we already kind of contribute to the speeding up of the overall process. Now, as a coalition, we work on different topics. We have addressed from the very beginning the need of having a robust maritime spatial planning. So maritime spatial planning is key when we talk about sustainable offshore wind. Of course, this means looking at the sea and actually trying to combine different activities and making sure also that these activities all have all are contributing and towards sustainable practices. At the same time, as Alfredo was mentioning, is also key when we want to address biodiversity from the very beginning to consider biodiversity along with other sustainability aspects, like, for instance, of course, the social aspects in the tendering process. So in Europe, is at the very center of the debate are non-price criteria. Therefore, we already see that there are experiences in the Netherlands, but also in other European countries, where from the beginning, we are incentivizing the performance, the environmental performance of those projects. And so that we look at those projects, we share practices, and very importantly, we also release recommendation on how to improve those processes. Also, then it's very important then to work on the infrastructure itself. We have been talking about minimizing the impact. Of course, avoidance and minimization, those are the first two steps of the mitigation hierarchy. These are key. We have collected in the North and the Baltic Sea over 80 mitigation measures. This is very important because sometimes this knowledge can be fragmented. So having this knowledge collected, but also endorsed by these different stakeholders group is very important. Now, these measures can be applied from the planning, so through siting and micro-siting, to the operation. We have experiences of curtailment. We have then also the decommissioning part, so that we have actually seen, because we need to look at the overall development and life cycle of the infrastructure itself. Now, this is not enough anymore because we are also talking about nature positive, so that enhancement is another aspect that we are looking very close at. So nature inclusive design, this is a concept that still requires some common definition because can be interpreted in different ways, but we are seeing already very promising experiences also from Ørsted, but also from other of our members, being scour protection, being fish holders, being coral reef. So different experiences that we will need to further test. We will need data, and data is at the center of the discussion, and also many of the previous speakers already mentioned this, in order then to understand actually the effectiveness of these measures, but also in order to inform then the adaptive management, because we will need, I mean, to have the courage to adapt the development based on the data and the science that we will collect. Last but not least, very important is then as Renewables Grid Initiative, which has started this platform called Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, we have also launched another initiative, which is called the Global Initiative for Nature, for Grids and Renewables. Actually, along with IUCN, we are working on frameworks in order to quantify contribution to enhancement, so that we can actually all agree on the precious contribution that offshore wind can give, not only to climate, but also to biodiversity then targets. Thanks a lot, Shamini.
Thank you, Christina, for sharing a lot of the details on some of the key work that your organization is doing. And I think that, you know, given that the conditions are not the same everywhere, the data collection is really key. And I'm glad that we are convened together in this forum, because there's different initiatives that are taking place that have somewhat similar sort of goals, and it would be good to coordinate together if possible, so that we can have the maximum impact. Let me move the conversation back to industry and to finance. Rebecca, my question is to you. So the Global Wind Energy Council released your latest annual report, and it highlights for a need for new approaches to concessional and blended finance to meet the multi-trillion-dollar investment requirements for offshore wind in emerging market. How can this be, you know, done effectively? And more importantly, share some insights from the report and then tell us what you're saying in there about this.
Thanks so much, Shamini, and thank you for the plug for our very recently launched report. So this is the Global Offshore Wind Report 2024, and it is the Bible, I would say, of all things offshore wind from an industry perspective. The key takeaways, I mean, they've already found their way into this panel session and into the opening comments, I'm very pleased to say. But the headlines are 75 gigawatts of offshore wind deployed overall worldwide now. A real growth story when we look out to the future. In fact, our outlook shows 410 gigawatts of offshore wind in the next decade. However, as usual, that's only if we're able to put in place the frameworks to really deliver against that offshore wind. And it, you know, it has been a turbulent period in some of the markets that we are working in. So in the US, there are a few hiccups, and also in the UK context too. I think we're now in a place where the industry is very much moving out of that period, and we're looking forward to this global growth trajectory and helping realize that through our collaboration between industry and government in public-private partnership. I'm really pleased to hear some of the initiatives outlined already. I'm really pleased to hear Ingrid's reflections as well, Ørsted, one of our key members too. So just to recap, GWEC is the global association for the wind sector, and we're working in many of the emerging markets. We're also talking about, from a financing perspective, working directly with these emerging market governments about how they can realize the opportunity of offshore wind. And actually, one of the things that we find from a financing perspective, and which is elaborated on at quite some length in the report, so I'm sure you're all eager to dive into those recommendations after this, certainly can send around and share a link. But in many of the fast-growing emerging markets in Asia, we don't have a problem with kind of lack of financing. Rather, it's how can we get the financing to properly permitted, bankable and economically viable projects. And that's the key challenge that we're all facing here in the industry. And then we look at other emerging markets, such as Brazil, who we're working very closely with the Brazilian government on the offshore wind industry in Brazil. again, the question is, how can we really help government and work with government to de-risk project development in Brazil, for instance? And so what we see is actually a real need to zero in on the enabling framework conditions for offshore wind. Offshore wind farms are complex structures, complex infrastructure structures. They're complex infrastructure projects. And when we're looking at the major cost of offshore wind, cost of capital has a huge impact. So if we raise the cost of capital of an offshore wind project by 1%, we end up raising the total project cost by about 8%. So you can see that the cost of financing has a disproportionate impact on offshore wind projects, which is why we've seen these dynamics in the market that we've seen over the past year or so. So the question is then, how can we reduce risk, reduce cost of capital? And the ways that we can do that are to de-risk the associated regulatory frameworks when it comes to offshore wind, looking at how we can speed up permitting, how we can work together and collaborate with governments to reduce risk in that project development cycle. But also, as you say, Shamini, how we can leverage different types of financing and funding to also de-risk some of the more difficult and less tangible aspects of project development. So in our report, we discussed the concept, for instance, of comfort and how we can give investors more comfort over risk. And the term comfort is something which, is very open to interpretation. One of the key things that we dive into is how blended finance could play a role in increasing investors' comfort and thereby reducing those longer term risks. So I'll be very pleased to go into this in a lot more detail with the rest of the participants in this call. And actually, I was really pleased to see Amisha Patel, the interim head of secretariat for the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, talk about the work that GOA is also doing in this regard to bring together governments and financiers both across the public and private space to unlock this at a diplomatic and global level. And then from an industry perspective, in each of the markets we're working in, we're also trying to target this from a specific level in that country. So very happy to go through that in much more detail with anyone who has greater interest. Otherwise, I'll leave it there for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, for sharing some of those insights. And I sort of speed talked through my presentation because I thought was running a bit behind, but thank you for going into some of the details on the financing aspect and why it's so critically important when we talk about, making it affordable and accessible. Now, let's, in terms of my next question, let me actually go back to Alfredo. You talked about supply, from a supply chain perspective, how can companies involved in offshore wind ensure that sustainability and biodiversity are prioritized throughout their life cycle of their projects, from sourcing materials to decommissioning? Christina talked a little bit about the life cycle aspect, but I'd love to hear about what WEF is doing on this.
Thank you so much. That's a great follow-up question. I think that the baseline here is that as we think about clean energy projects, the whole supply chain should be considered. And not only the development itself, but also the supply chain and the dependencies and the impacts that that whole process has on nature. So today, most of the attention on offshore wind development and the environment focuses on the possible impact of marine life during the construction and operation of the wind farms. But we are still a little bit behind in those other items that you mentioned, but also in the considerations about people. And I think that those two are very important for us if we want to really think about sustainability in a broader sense. In order to do this, we need to, of course, be paying attention to the related industries, such as mining and metals, construction equipments, electrical components, transportations, ports and services, and finally, transmission, as we were hearing both from Christina and Rebecca. So in order to do this, we have a series of reports at the World Economic Forum called Sector Transitions to Nature Positive that take a look at each of the sectors that we work with and go to define what are some of the dependencies that that sector has on nature, what are some of the impacts, and what are some of the priority actions that need to be taken by the sector and the whole supply chain. And we do a deep dive analysis on this. And so some of the things that we want to address are what parts of the value chain should be considered when we think about those impacts and dependencies. What are some of the top drivers of nature loss through that process? And what progress has been made that we can highlight as we go out on this. So this report is also looking at some specifics on how does this relate to greenhouse gas emissions, to water and waste management, to other technologies to ensure circularity. And so we are really excited to be putting this out there specifically for offshore wind in the next iteration. So just to close this point, the report is going to go out for public consultation. And thank you very much to many of you in this call who have already contributed as part of the experts group to it. It's going out in the next 2 weeks, if I am correct. And we will be incorporating all of your feedback to make sure that it contributes not only with that delineation, but also with good, inspiring examples of what could be next in this transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo. I wanted to really touch on that whole life cycle aspect, supply chain, because that is a critical component of ensuring the sustainability of these projects. While I had prepared ambitiously multiple questions for each of you, in the interest of time, I'm actually going to ask all of you one question and then ask each of you to respond. Given that this dialogue we're hosting is to inform the G20 on the specific topic, right? Because once this conversation is over, we'll be submitting a policy brief based on the conversation we had here. So I'd like to pose a question to all of you. If there is one thing, one key thing that you'd like to get in front of the G20 around, enabling offshore wind in a sustainable way, what would that message be? Ingrid, I'll go to you first.
Thank you very much, Minnie. I think I can be very quick because for our part, it's about moving from ambition to action. Because we have seen great political ambitions and we're very grateful for that. But what we need to see now is that those have to be translated into concrete plans, concrete action, removal of barriers, speed up, get the scale, get the volume out, all that to ensure the predictability, lower the risk, as was also mentioned. And with that, we are ready as an industry to participate, to share, and to invest. So it's moving from the political headlines to real action.
I like that. Ambition to action. And let me go to Charlotte next.
Thank you so much. Well, from a foundation point of view, I think it's really important. I actually have two requests. I'm sorry, but I think one is really to, engage the philanthropy community like they do under the IOC and the Ocean Decade of Science, where they have initiated, different foundations, cooperation to achieve the SDG 14 and, in general, some of the SDGs, one of the 17 SDGs. I think that's would be a really good initiative. Secondly, I think when we are looking at our perspective as a foundation and our perspective in conservation of oceans and making sure that the best practices are used when you develop anything, whether it's offshore wind or shipping and things like that, I think it's really important for us that there will be a common level playing field for biodiversity concerns. So every industry around the world actually has to comply with the same conservation concerns and take them into account. I think that will be valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me go over to Christina next.
Thanks, Shamini. I would say I would echo partially what actually Charlotte just said, because it's very important to embed, as I said, it's one of our main recommendations to embed biodiversity from the very early stages, because then it becomes actually much more difficult later on. And so that this means really working towards embedding those in bidding and tenders, and also very importantly, to make sure that they become then on step by step, they become standards. So we're all talking about standards, and this is very important. Then we can have standards and we can have competition on even more ambitious practices. But second, also support collaborative efforts, because what is clear and what is a concern of the environmental community is that this speed might be at the cost then of actually not reaching biodiversity targets, and therefore it is very important then to create and support, to create funds also through these tenders and these buildings in order to support the active participation of the different stakeholders group, in order to bring the different perspective and knowledge, very important, and then to have a holistic and collective approach to the way forward. Thanks, Shami.
Alfredo.
Thank you. I think I just want to echo what was said, and in terms of we really need to get these practices to the point where they become standards. And if we are going to ask something of some of the largest markets in this planet for offshore wind, it's going to be to the G20 members to really put this forward. And what a better way for the O20, for the Oceans 20 to deliver on something like that. The only other thing to add that is not necessarily going to the member states, but to all of us, is to continue building these bridges that we are building. All of us are working on different parts of this puzzle, and really it's up to us to present that cohesive narrative so that the countries can act on it and know exactly what is it that this whole community is proposing. So, yeah.
Thank you. I like that. Rebecca, I'm going to give you the final word.
I think Ingrid actually summed it up really nicely. I mean, we stand here ready to deliver and to work with governments in the G20 to really push forward their offshore wind ambitions and make those into a reality. But if I had one word to kind of sum up the financing picture, I think it's, let's work on getting those bankable projects, getting that volume into the market, and work together on realizing that through fast and efficient permitting, so that projects are also not stuck in this limbo period where they're exposed to greater risk. In terms of the wider financing piece, all the answers I'm sure are in our offshore wind report. So we'll ping you the link to that, and looking forward to having many good conversations around the recommendations in there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all of you for joining this panel, for taking the time from your mornings, afternoons, evenings. I think most of you, it's your afternoon because you're not in North America. So thank you very much. I just want to end with saying, often Ocean Conservancy gets asked, why as a conservation organization are we pushing on this issue? Because we know that climate change is the biggest threat to the ocean, and decarbonizing the energy sector is critical to ensuring, we meet our climate goals, but also to protect the ocean. And there are concerns about offshore wind, but it's important to remember that it's not just offshore renewables that impact biodiversity. Oil and gas exploration does. And the oil spills that we've consistently hear about in different places, and the climate change that results from burning these fossil fuels chip at the future that we want. So, advancing offshore renewables at a pace and scale that's needed in a way that doesn't impact biodiversity is critical. And I really loved the way Alfredo framed it about continuing to build the bridges and to work on the collaborative aspect of this so that we do this right. And with that, I will end this panel. Thank you to all our panelists. And I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Anna Marie Laura, who is the Senior Director of Climate Policy at Ocean Conservancy. And she will moderate our next panel that will focus on NDCs. Over to you, Anna Marie.
Thank you so much, Shamini, and thank you to the entire panel. It's really great to hear all the action, moving from ambition to action, and the specifics that were provided about how we do that, from protecting biodiversity to providing the finance. We have a great second panel, and we're going to stay within time. So what this panel is going to focus on quickly is nationally determined contributions as one of the ways, a really important way, that the Paris Agreement, and trying to meet the Paris Agreement and stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, can be used to reach the scale and speed for offshore renewables that Secretary Kerry mentioned in the beginning. So I want to welcome the panel. For the second panel, please turn on your cameras and we'll bring you into the conversation. I'll briefly introduce them. We do have Hanne Jessold, who is the Chief Advisor of Denmark's Ministry of Climate, Energy, and Utilities. Welcome, Hanne. We have Simon Ben-Maraz, who is he leads the technology and innovation team at IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. Hi, Simon. We have Juan Pablo Hoffmeister, and who is the Associate Vice President of Global Cooperation at EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, and Megan Cuddy. Megan is an ocean policy analyst at the U.S. Department of State. She leads a portfolio focused on ocean and climate, both at the Office of the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate and at the Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs. Welcome all, thank you for being here. So we'll do something similar to the first panel. I have one question for each of you that speaks to your expertise, and then one question for everyone. So Hanne, starting with you, Denmark, as we learned, is one of the founders of the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, but Denmark also currently co-chairs the NDC partnership, Nationally Determined Contributions, which, just backing up, NDCs, of course, are the ways that countries submit a climate action plan or how they're going to commit to reducing emissions as part of their contribution to achieving the Paris Agreement. So Hanne, the NDC partnership, how is this working to support countries in scaling up offshore wind, other marine renewables, and what can Denmark share from its experience in the NDC partnership and supporting other countries?
Thank you very much for organizing this, and thank you very much for inviting me to give a little perspective on this from the Danish side. So let me start by saying that as co-chair of the NDC partnership, it is a huge, you can say, priority for Denmark that the partnership supports especially mitigation efforts such as offshore wind. As a matter of fact, so far, very little has been raised through the NDC partnership, specifically on offshore wind, at least as far as I know. So you could say the country member requests that go through the partnership have so far exclusively taken a broader focus on renewable energy, and I'm pretty sure that Simon, who has joined us from IRENA's side and who is also working on this specifically, will be able to maybe explain a bit more on this. But you can say that, seen from our perspective moving forward, it is indeed relevant to explore how sectorial support to countries can be facilitated and strengthened, including through the NDC partnership. And it is worth noting that the global call for NDCs 3.0 highlights the importance of developing more ambitious and implementable NDCs comprising sectorial focuses. So you can say that the call is there, and the NDC partnership is ready to support offshore wind ambitions through its support mechanism if the partnership receive such requests from members. And when it comes to Denmark's own experiences, you can say, well, you can say as a EU member state, Denmark does not have its own, national NDC, but Denmark has a long experience of political target setting in the energy sector as part of its national medium to long-term energy planning and implementation, including for offshore wind. And this has indeed been an important factor in driving the Danish development of offshore wind. So I think this, of course, also shows the value of having this sectoral focus, but with a very important, you can say, but very important to highlight that, well, target is one thing and implementation is another. And the implementation is, of course, key, but you can say the target setting may be one of the first things to drive that ambition forward into action. So, yeah, I think I will stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, great to hear that connection between asking for support, parties and members asking for the support, and then being able to provide it, and the need for those requests to come in from members. Simon, building on Hanne, and since she pointed to what IRENA is doing, maybe you can also talk a little bit just about how IRENA is in a position to provide technical expertise to parties, to member countries, and then how any specifics on how you're seeing offshore wind and renewables, marine renewables show up in these kinds of commitments.
Thank you, Anna Marie. Just checking you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, very good. I mean, first of all, we are very honored to be with you today on. I think it's a topic of paramount importance. The integration of offshore energy into NDCs is something Hannah mentioned. Hannah just said from Denmark and mentioned. I think that's really the blue ocean aspect. Like it's a vast and often untapped potential for our oceans, with many countries have access to this resource to be a beacon for this increase of ambition. And I think from Marina's side, first of all, from our scenario work, we see offshore wind as a transformative opportunity, not only to decarbonize the power system, but also to drive economic growth, creating jobs, also often upskilling the workforce that has worked in fossil fuels and enhance energy security. And we here with the also colleagues to protect our marine ecosystem. And in the next, let's say, 12 to 18 months, countries around the world will prepare and update the NDCs. And I think IRENA, along the amazing work from the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, will look at the strategic integration of offshore wind renewables, not only as a viable option, but also as a way to really accelerate the uptake and build credible NDCs. So the first aspect, really, IRENA, you mentioned, Anna-Marie, that IRENA work is really to support countries to customize policy recommendation, and also making sure that at the government level, they have the technical expertise to really develop robust regulatory frameworks. Hannah just mentioned the work of the NDC partnership, which often embed technical advisors in the government to really do that, not as a one-off, but also to really do it as a long-standing on the NDC enhancement. So it means making better NDCs, but also in the very important aspect of NDC implementation. So for offshore wind, it means looking at detailed resource assessments, design auction mechanism, and also making sure that when the energy is generated, that we look at grid integration strategy. So how this energy will be offloaded. IRENA also facilitate knowledge exchange, and this is something through the Global Offshore Wind Alliance we want to really support many new members, the 30 members of GOA, but also to look at capacity building. And I think that's connecting policymakers and industry stakeholders, like the colleague from GWEC mentioned, with best practices and the lesson learned from 2024 and onward, and the latest advancement, because obviously IRENA works for many years to help countries to understand how intermittent energies, solar PV, wind, can really address the issue of like decarbonization. Today, offshore wind is not an intermittent technology. That's a really thought-provoking aspect. We need to look at that really in the NDCs. And I will stop here on the aspect that IRENA can do, but I think we want to really promote cooperation, regional cooperation. We have, for example, through GOA, an exciting event later this year for the APAC region, and the development of collaborative frameworks to foster the sharing of resources, expertise, best practices to accelerate to that country that have access to this resource to put them in the NDCs. And this is not really something difficult, and we'll be there with GOA, but also through technical assistance with NDC partnership to empower this transition and to make sure that we have the correct aspect there, because we have a lot of misinformation about offshore wind, about it's taking too long and it's destroy ecosystem. But today, together with our partners, we really have the knowledge to really bridge that and put that in writing to advance the Paris Agreement.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simon. It's great to hear, at this all at once, these different resources that are available for countries looking to expand, and for us as partners to know that these resources are available, from the NDC partnership to IRENA itself. And also you mentioned the Global Offshore Wind Alliance playing this convening and connecting role. These are great resources for all of us to know about. Juan Pablo, I want to turn to you. You have experience with the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility. And in the first panel, we really highlighted this need for multilateral sort of involvement and in some cases reform to make sure there's additional climate finance going into offshore marine renewables. Can you talk a little bit about how we can use NDCs to leverage this multilateral engagement, and vice versa? How can the NDCs inspire them to act?
Definitely. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and I'm happy to touch on a couple of points. This is a very rich topic, and I know there's a lot that we could say, so I'm really appreciative of you having convened this space. So I think, first of all, we have to recognize that the NDCs have come to take central stage when it comes to countries' climate investment. They are the ones who really provide the guiding framework, even if they don't contain the full details of the specifics of the type of activities that are to be taken on the ground. But basically, at this point, Green Climate Fund, the GEF, and really all the MDBs, I think they will struggle to finance something if it's not clearly identified as a priority in an NDC when it comes to sort of their climate portfolio. Of course, there might be exceptions, but it really has become the investment guidebook for countries. So with that in mind, I think perhaps it's important to sort of emphasize what are some of the possible roles that institutions like the GCF and the GEF can play. I mean, obviously, the financing and particularly financing at scale is an obvious first point. Institutions like the MDBs and the climate funds can support programmatic approaches that bring together smaller projects to achieve scale. And these include nowadays not only from the context of mitigation, but also from the context of adaptation, where energy can be just as useful. But more than that, I think that we also have to realize, because these institutions don't have all the money that will be required for the transition, that we need to understand the important role that they can play in capacity building and creating enabling frameworks to help countries develop these more ambitious and implementable NDCs, particularly as we are now in the route to revising those NDCs next year. Some of this capacity building and creation of enabling framework support may involve improving inventories, creating investment platforms, having the required mitigation and adaptation analysis, policy development, etc. But I think it's important then to recognize that these institutions can be critical in de-risking and capitalizing private investment in NDCs through blended finance, through guarantees, and other mitigation instruments. And this is, of course, extremely relevant in the context of capital-intensive sectors, like would be the case of offshore renewable energy. The last point, and of course, having made emphasis on the possibility of these institutions leading investment platforms that can help pull in capital from private sector, the last point I'd like to raise is around the value of knowledge sharing that institutions like the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, and other MDBs can play, whether it is from a South-South cooperation perspective or just in general, being able to make the information accessible as to like how other countries are managing to break certain barriers and collaborating with institutions like ARENA, for example, in making sure that this experience in financing renewable energy, it's something that can be translated through the right insights and knowledge sharing to other countries. It's a potential contribution that should not be undermined.
Wonderful, thank you. It is great to hear again, sort of building on Henny's earlier remarks, how NDCs can be this signal sender to the multilaterals about where investment is needed. Megan, turning to you, the U.S. has a very ambitious economy-wide NDC, so obviously no sectoral targets. But the Biden administration has set a goal, a national goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030 that has catalyzed development in the U.S. This is one example of some ways that NDCs can inspire other national plans. What are other examples of plans and tools countries have building on the targets set in their NDCs?
Yeah, thanks, Anna Marie. And yes, you're correct that US does have an economy-wide NDC target of reducing our net greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below our 2005 levels in 2030. And our NDC does not include any sectoral targets, including offshore wind. But we do have a very ambitious NDC, as you said, and the administration's 30 by 30 goal on offshore wind, along with our goal to achieve 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035, are really key benchmarks that can help leverage the ocean to support that overall objective of our NDC and to reach net zero by 2050. And so setting this specific call to action on offshore wind, as the Biden administration has done, has really helped to rapidly move the needle on advancements in the industry, particularly domestically. In the past few years, we've seen billions of dollars of public and private investment mobilized into offshore wind, as well as the approval of 9 commercial offshore wind farms along the Atlantic coast in the US. And we think that this is a model that can potentially work for others as well. Of course, every party's circumstances and capabilities are different, but we do encourage parties to consider ways to incorporate ocean-based climate action into their existing plans and products, into their national climate goals, their existing and new long-term strategies, or their adaptation planning. There are a variety of ways to do this. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but in the United States, we've included our offshore wind goals, as well as very specific line items and actions to achieve those goals within our National Ocean Climate Action Plan, which was released in March of 2023. And offshore wind also features very heavily into our national strategy for sustainable ocean economy, which fulfills one of our commitments as an ocean panel country. And we just released that this past June. And taking this very holistic approach to incorporating ocean-based climate action into our broader climate ambition has really worked for us as a means to make very focused, ambitious progress in specific areas like offshore wind. And as was already mentioned, action is just as important as implementation. And agencies have really been taking steps to actively implement these plans, and we're well on our way to achieving those goals. In addition to the approved projects that I mentioned earlier, in April, the Department of Interior released a roadmap to identify 12 additional offshore wind leasing areas in 2028. We've also seen increased investment in things like research and development across federal agencies on things like environmental impacts of offshore wind and developing transmission infrastructure. And just one more thing I'd like to mention that has already been spoken to by several folks is the important tool of partnership at all levels of governance. Domestically, we've seen incredible collaboration between the federal government and very ambitious subnational governments, and that's been so important to the progress that we've made in the United States. Identifying leasing areas has actually been very responsive to state targets on renewable energy. A great example of this is the Central Atlantic lease sale that's actually happening right now, that's reflective of energy goals in mid-Atlantic states like Maryland and Delaware. And international partnerships are just as critical here. Through a variety of partnerships, GOA, IRENA, we see really great potential to create communities of practice, to share information, and to ultimately help support global offshore wind deployment and ambition. Because as we're making investments here at home in the United States, we also want to make sure we're bringing down costs and bringing down barriers so that the entire industry can benefit. And just to close, it goes without saying that bolstering ambition on offshore wind is particularly important this year as we move towards our new 2035 NDCs.
Thank you. And yes, thanks for the reminder. NDCs, of course, are the updated NDCs are due in 2025, and building on a global stock take last year that said we're not on track. And so these NDCs and the increased ambition is critical to meeting the climate goals set by the Paris Agreement. I just want to thank you all because we're at time. We're going to move into our closing remarks. But it's wonderful to hear this connection from, the signals sent in ambition raising documents like NDCs and how that flows to implementation, unlocking financing, regulatory environment, et cetera. And again, the resources available that you all have mentioned, we'll be sure to capture in the brief and the summary. So thank you. Actually, if we have a little bit more time, what I might do is just ask you all one final question. We'll do a round robin. Similar to, we connected a lot in the first panel about the need for finance, and we've talked here about these NDCs as important ambition tools. So if we want to just go around one more time, if we have one recommendation to make to the G20 countries, how do you all, what would that be to flag for them this important connection, and how the NDCs can help raise finance? Maybe Simon, I'll go over to you.
Thank you, Anna Marie. I think it's, I mean, the silver lining is not today about adding a new layer of existing NDCs. It's about a fundamental shift in our thinking. We need to move from a fragmented sectoral approach to a comprehensive understanding of how the ocean, as a complex interconnected system, brings to the climate action. I think we need to move beyond silos, embrace its cross-sectoral collaboration. Through initiatives like GOA, we must break down the barriers between energy, fisheries, transport, and conservation. Arena work also look at how we integrate climate resilience and biodiversity consideration into marine spatial planning. So MSP must evolve beyond static zoning and must embrace a more dynamic, adaptive approach that incorporates climate change scenarios and ecosystem-based management there. And last but not least, on the work with the non-state actors, we need to look at nature-based solutions, investing in the restoration, conservation of coastal and marine ecosystem, such as mangroves, seagrass, and coral reef. Powerful aspect on look at mitigation and also looking at adaptation. I think that's the word on NDC 3.0, looking at avoiding silos and embracing offshore as a whole, protecting the ocean, but also delivering this dispatchable, secure solution that embrace many countries are today embracing around the world.
Wonderful. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, in addition to all of the good stuff that has already been brought up, I would say, and maybe echo what has already been said, actually, but that, I mean, capacity building and collaboration are two extremely important factors in actually, you can say, being successful in this in this ambition, if we are going to turn ambition into action. So you can say this multi-stakeholder, public-private partnership and collaboration will be extremely important. And this is what initiatives such as the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, but also other initiatives, that's exactly what they are seeking to do, and why it's so important that we are all finding places where we can actually gather and work together. Thanks.
Thank you. Juan Pablo?
Thanks. We'll try to keep it to two core points in my view. One is the importance of country-driven long-term certainty. And here I'm combining a few elements, but I think it's of course important in order to be able to have the predictability in finance that the signals from countries provide, not only identifying offshore renewable as a priority, but actually to put it in the context of the decarbonization roadmap that is developed in partnership with the industry and that has the long-term strategies aligned with the NDCs to provide that policy certainty that is required for investment. The second point that I sort of want to sort of flag as something to stress as critical is ensuring that all these approaches are people-centered as well, and that they respond to the needs of local communities. Particularly when you talk about innovative finance, for example, we tend to sort of sometimes not connect the fact that a lot of these instruments are not responding to coastal communities and that they don't really permeate in that informal economy that is prevalent in a lot of coastal communities. So we need to think about how these benefits trickle as well to these communities because a lot of them are just completely outside of all these big investment decisions. And this is where we start having a lot of pushback around some of these this long-term investment. So I will definitely stress that if poorly designed, energy-related infrastructure projects can be dangerous to local communities, and this is why it's so important that we keep this people-centered approach and involve them so that the difficult trade-offs that will surely need to happen are sort of well thought through and done and identified in a participatory and transparent way.
Wonderful, and connects so well to the investment and capacity building that's needed, and community engagement is a critical part of that, as well as marine spatial planning. Megan, over to you for some last remarks.
Yeah, thanks so much, and really appreciate all of the thoughts and remarks of everyone else. My final thoughts actually quite closely echo Juan Pablo's. Of course, as the United States, we encourage countries to set ambitious economy-wide 1.5 aligned NDCs for 2035. And we encourage them to consider the many ways that the ocean can really be harnessed to achieve those goals, including through climate mitigation strategies like offshore wind. But we also particularly want to encourage the thought that identifying offshore wind and other ocean-based climate solutions as priorities in long-term strategies and climate goals and targets, and in the documentation that accompanies countries' NDCs really does send an important signal about where finance and investment is needed to other governments, to multilateral institutions, to private investment and other sources of funding. And this prioritization messaging can really show that offshore wind and other ocean-based climate actions are top of mind for governments, and they can really play a key role in advancing the industry and moving from that ambition to that action that is so needed.
Thank you, and thank you all. This has been a great discussion about the role of NDCs and other national plans and strategies that can really help reach the scale and speed we need to see with offshore renewables. Thank you. And just want to also thank the first panel and Secretary Kerry. It's wonderful that the government of Brazil has initiated these G20 dialogues so we can have these forums and discussions that feed into the process. For some closing remarks, I'm now going to turn it over to Karen Sack. Karen is the Executive Director of the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance and a longtime champion of these issues and ocean climate solutions. So Karen, over to you to close the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. It's really lovely to be here, and it's been a really fascinating discussion for me this morning. I think key is that we've learned that of the 315 offshore wind farms worldwide, only one is operational in an emerging economy outside of China. Yet the potential that we've heard for the sector is, well, it's oceanic. That said, of course, the level of investment that is needed to jumpstart the ambition and turn it into action is really at the moment that proverbial drop in the ocean. And there's a critical gap for emerging economies, particularly given that G20 members account for 99% of potential installed offshore wind capacity. So enabling the mix of financing, the blending of the grants, the loans, the guarantees, and the bonds that are needed for the sector really is key. And part of that is to enable the volume of bankable projects and to deploy them quickly and efficiently while reducing risk exposure. It's, I think, really important to think about what these investments could mean in terms of national energy independence as well as food security, breaking down the negative feedback loops that currently keep coastal developing countries and small island developing states locked into a status quo, for many selling fish to earn foreign exchange, to purchase high-priced diesel fuel that has to be shipped across the ocean, releasing emissions, and then burned to power their economies. Those are the types of cycles we need to try and break, and we can. At ORA, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, radical collaboration is what we do. And Hannah spoke to this a little bit. What we do is we bring together the finance and insurance sectors, multilateral, civil society, and governments to focus on developing and deploying the finance and insurance products that can achieve both climate and nature positive outcomes with community engagement. And our mission by 2030 is to deploy at least $500 million of investment into coastal and ocean resilience in the global south, and in so doing, build the resilience of 250 million climate vulnerable coastal people. We are singularly focused on activating investments into 6 key regenerative and sustainable blue economy sectors: ocean conservation, sustainable seafood, the circular economy and blue tech, sustainable blue infrastructure, ridge to reef integrated solutions, and of course, ocean-based renewables. Work that we commissioned earlier this year indicates that across these 6 sectors, there's the potential to deploy a median of $550 billion of investment per annum globally between now and 2030, and 40 to 140 billion of that investment potential each year into ocean-based renewables. And that includes, of course, wind, as well as smaller scale wave, solar, and tidal power. The Ocean Conservancy study on the role of concessional finance in catalyzing responsible offshore wind in emerging economies was part of their in-kind contribution as a member of AURA, and a wonderful example of how, by working together, we can scale our collective impact. It shows that blended finance with public, private, and philanthropic sector engagement is really key to jumpstarting the investment that is needed into the sector, and that $10 billion in concessional finance could be just the spark that is needed to begin to deliver the Pathfinder offshore wind projects that will be the bridgehead for the development of this market. And it's absolutely critical that the public sector international financing institutions step forward quickly, and that climate finance is mobilized to facilitate investment into the sector, as well as to establish an enabling regulatory and policy environment, which was so clearly emphasized today by Rebecca and Christina. The motto of the G20 Brazilian presidency is building a just world and a sustainable planet. There's an ocean of investment opportunity in offshore renewables that'll help fight hunger and poverty, enable social inclusion with sustainable development, showcase the needed reforms in global governance institutions that enable the finance we need for the future that we want, and deliver the energy transition with biodiversity and community positive outcomes for a regenerative and sustainable common future. The opportunity is staring us in the face. So let's get to work and get it done. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for your closing remarks, and to all our panelists for joining us today, for our opening remarks from Secretary Carey, from Eric and Amisha, and for all of you for tuning in. We appreciate your insights, inputs, questions in the chat. And if you have any follow-up questions or want to engage with us and collaborate, do feel free to reach out. Thank you very much and have a good day.